Sit down or get out, she snapped. But Elijah didn't sit, because sitting meant pain, so she made him pay for it. It was 9:14 when Elijah Monroe, 13 years old, slipped into room 204 at River Heights Middle School. His back was already screaming with tension, but he clutched his backpack like armor and tried to walk in quietly. Miss Darlene Whitmore, the school's most feared math teacher, didn't miss a beat. Her chalk froze mid-formula, and her eyes narrowed beneath her silver-rimmed glasses. Late again. Monroe, she said, voice sharp as broken glass. Pick a seat and try to act like you belong here. For once, Elijah hesitated. His gaze darted toward the empty desk in the second row, but then returned to Ms. Whitmore. May I stand today, ma'am? His voice was soft, respectful, but edged with pain. Excuse me. She blinked. You want to stand? This isn't recess. Young man, take your seat. My back's hurting. I have a spine condition, he said. Sitting too long makes it worse. Snickers rippled through the classroom. A boy near the window muttered, "Here we go again." Whitmore's expression tightened into something almost gleeful. Spine condition. Is it? Convenient excuse. Yesterday it was an asthma flare. Last week you said your legs cramped. I have scoliosis, Elijah said. Barely audible. That's enough. She slammed her textbook shut. If you won't follow instructions, then you'll entertain the class with something useful. She erased the basic algebra equation from the board, replacing it with a second-year college-level calculus integration problem. It snaked across the board in white chalk, sharp and cruel. This, she said, turning to the stunned room, is not for your 8th grade minds. It's from my old AP calculus class. Elijah seems eager to be different. Let's see what he's got. The class laughed. Elijah felt the heat rise to his face, but he didn't move. Not toward the chair, not away from the challenge. You have 5 minutes, Whitmore added, glancing at her watch. Or it's detention, a whole week. Elijah stared at the board, at the swirling symbols, at the integral that had stumped many a senior, and then something inside him clicked. For almost a year, Elijah had been studying calculus on his own. While his classmates played video games or watched TikToks, he spent evenings hunched in the corner of the public library, lit by the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp. Online tutorials, old college textbooks from thrift stores, printouts taped above his bunk bed. He had been quietly devouring it all. His father, a warehouse loader with a brilliant mind, never nurtured, had once said, "You got what I never had. Son, patience with numbers. Don't waste it." At school, Elijah had learned to shrink himself. He didn't talk about the math he loved, not after the time he corrected a teacher and was sent to the hallway for disrespect. But this wasn't about showing off. It was about surviving. He picked up the dry erase marker. The room went quiet. The laughter died first, then the whispers. Even Zeke, the boy who usually mocked Elijah at lunch, was frowning in confusion. Elijah's hand moved slowly, but with purpose. Each line he wrote flowed into the next, like it belonged there. He paused only once to double-check his U substitution, and then continued, filling the board with step-by-step calculations. 3 minutes in, you could hear a pin drop. One student whispered, "Wait, is he actually doing this?" Another muttered, "That looks like real math." Whitmore's arms were crossed, but her jaw was twitching. Elijah stepped back, capped the marker, and underlined the final answer. Then he turned to face the room. Silence. Miss Whitmore approached the board like it might explode. She squinted at the work, her finger hovering above a critical line, then moving to the next, and the next. Her lips parted, closed, then parted again. This isn't, she muttered. Where did you learn this? I taught myself, Elijah said simply. She stared at him. The class held its breath, and then, like a storm breaking, she snatched the eraser and wiped the board clean. That's enough, she said, voice cold. There's no way you solved that alone. You must have cheated, memorized it, or found the answer online. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. I didn't cheat. You're disrupting the class. Take your things. Principal's office. Now. He hesitated. Now. As he left the room, he didn't look back. But behind him, 20 students sat frozen. Not because a classmate had been punished, but because, for the first time, they had seen something undeniable. The quiet boy, who always stood in the back of the room, had just stood up to a system that never once believed in him. And the system didn't like that. The principal's office was quiet, too quiet. Elijah sat stiffly on the bench outside, his backpack in his lap, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor. His back still throbbed, and his fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the hollow exhaustion of knowing no one would believe him. Inside, behind the frosted glass, Miss Whitmore's voice was rising. Insubordination, fabricated ability, completely inappropriate, then quieter. There's simply no way a student with a C- average could have solved that problem legitimately. Elijah had heard enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to breathe, trying not to imagine the chalk-dusted equations erased from the board, as if they'd never existed, trying not to feel the sting of the word cheater in his ears. And then a voice broke through his spiral. Light, surprised, and familiar. Thompson, you okay? Elijah looked up. Miss Rainey, the young science teacher, with bright eyes and a habit of speaking to students like their minds mattered, stood in the doorway. She spotted the detention slip in his hand and frowned. Before he could answer, Principal Hart opened the office door. Come in, he said shortly. Inside, Miss Whitmore sat like a statue, spine straight, arms folded, chin high. Elijah stepped in slowly and sat opposite her. Principal Hart cleared his throat. Miss Whitmore tells me there was an incident in your math class this morning. Disruption, defiance, and academic dishonesty. Elijah said nothing. Well, the principal prompted. Did you cheat, Elijah? No, sir, he said softly. I solved the problem. Miss Whitmore scoffed audibly. Solved it. He stood in front of my class and performed a stunt. A stunt? Elijah's voice rose before he could stop it. You gave me a problem to embarrass me. I solved it. That's not a stunt. Her nostrils flared. You couldn't possibly understand that material. You failed every test I've given you. That's because your tests don't measure what I know, Elijah said. Louder now. I study calculus at the library. I've been teaching myself for a year. Ridiculous, she snapped. There's no proof of that. You expect us to believe you're a self-taught genius? Principal Hart raised his hand. Enough. There was a pause. Then, another knock. The door opened again. Miss Rainey stepped inside, a fire in her eyes. Apologies for the interruption, she said, but I believe I may have some context. Miss Whitmore stiffened. This doesn't concern the science department. It does. If you're punishing one of my best students, Rainey replied sharply. Elijah worked with advanced statistical modeling during the science fair last spring. He built a project that mapped the rate of plant growth using exponential functions and real-time data. He was the only 8th grader in the top 5 finalists, and the youngest to ever use differential equations in our school's fair. Whitmore's eyes flickered. Principal Hart looked surprised. Why wasn't this in his academic file? Elijah asked me not to tell anyone, Rainey said, glancing at the boy. He didn't want to draw attention. That's absurd, Whitmore said, but her voice was thinner now. He's disruptive. He's arrogant, and he refused to sit down. Because sitting hurts, Elijah said. Finally, you hit me with a ruler last week. No one believed me then, either. That stopped everything. The room froze. Hart turned slowly to Ms. Whitmore. Is that true? She fumbled. He was slouching. I was trying to correct his posture. It wasn't malicious. Enough, Hart said. Quieter, but steel in his tone now. We'll investigate that separately. He looked at Elijah. You claim to have taught yourself calculus. Yes, sir. Then we'll give you a test. Supervised. Controlled. If you pass, there will be no question of your ability. I want someone else to make the test, Elijah said. Not her. Principal Hart considered that. Fair enough. We'll bring in someone impartial. Miss Rainey stepped forward. I have someone in mind. A contact at State University. Professor Leo Stein. He volunteers at the community center. He's brilliant. Principal Hart nodded. Make the call. Later that evening, Elijah sat in the back corner of River Heights Public Library, textbooks and scrap paper spread out around him. His eyes burned, but he kept writing. He didn't hear the footsteps until a low, thoughtful voice interrupted. That substitution method you're using, It works, but there's a cleaner way. Want me to show you? Elijah looked up. A tall, white-haired man with a corduroy blazer and a kind smile stood nearby. He was holding a differential equations textbook under one arm. "You're Professor Stein?" Elijah asked. The man nodded. "Call me Leo. You're going to write my test." I am, Stein said. "But tonight, I'm just here to understand how your mind works. No pressure." Elijah stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" Leo smiled. "Because someone helped me once, and because rare minds deserve to be recognized, not erased." They sat together for the next 2 hours, and when they parted ways, Leo placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder and said, "Tomorrow, you're not just taking a test, you're taking back your name." At 7:55, Elijah stood outside the school's administrative wing, his palms sweating despite the cool spring air. He'd barely slept. Every formula he knew swirled in his head, and somewhere behind them was the memory of Miss Whitmore's voice, doubting, dismissing, degrading. But today, that voice wouldn't be the final word. At exactly 8:00, Principal Hart opened the conference room door, clipboard in hand. Behind him stood Professor Leo Stein, dressed neatly in navy, his briefcase held like it carried the truth. "Ready?" Stein asked. Elijah nodded. His throat was too dry for words. Inside the conference room, a single desk waited, bare except for pencils, a scientific calculator, and a water bottle. Miss Rainey stood near the window, her presence steadying, quiet, unspoken support radiating from her posture. Miss Whitmore was not invited. Principal Hart gestured to the seat. "You'll have 2 hours. If you need a break, raise your hand. Otherwise, the room is yours." Stein set the test down. 8 pages long. No fluff. No gimmicks. Just math. Elijah took a deep breath and began. 10 minutes in, Stein leaned toward Hart and whispered, "He's already through algebra and trig. He's skipping steps because he understands the logic between them." 30 minutes later, Elijah was halfway through calculus. He didn't look up. The numbers didn't scare him. What scared him was how much this moment meant, and how fragile it still felt. He wasn't just solving problems. He was defending his name, his mind, his worth. 95 minutes in, Elijah put his pencil down, not because time was up, because he was done. Professor Stein took the paper silently. He didn't speak. He only read, line by line, page by page. When he reached the final problem, a complex application of integration and limit theory, his eyebrows lifted slightly. Then he smiled. At noon, the results were in. Principal Hart called a meeting in the small auditorium, staff, board reps, even a few parents. Word had gotten out. There was no stopping it now. Elijah sat in the front row, between his mother and father. Miss Rainey stood behind him, and to the side, barely able to hide her frown, sat Miss Whitmore. Hart took the stage. "This morning," he began, "a student you all know took a test designed by a university professor. This test covered mathematics from 8th grade through university-level calculus." He looked down at the results, then back at the audience. Elijah didn't just pass, he aced it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. In fact, Hart continued, he solved all 8 problems, offered alternative methods for 5 of them, and identified an error in the final problem's initial setup. An error the professor himself missed. The auditorium fell into stunned silence. Professor Stein stepped forward. "I've taught math for 32 years. I've mentored PhDs. I've reviewed national competitions. And let me be clear, Elijah Thompson's performance ranks among the top 1% I've ever seen." Gasps. Stunned faces. Elijah's parents exchanged glances of disbelief, then pride so sharp it almost hurt. Stein turned toward Elijah. "You have what we call mathematical vision," he said. "You don't just compute, you see the structure underneath. That's a gift, and it deserves to be cultivated, not crushed." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Elijah didn't want to hide. But Principal Hart wasn't finished. "We must also address what led us here," he said gravely. And the failure to recognize Elijah's talent wasn't an isolated error. It was part of a larger problem. He turned to Ms. Whitmore. "You accused a student of cheating. You tore up his work. You struck him. Then you tried to erase his voice with shame." Whitmore stiffened. You're basing this on one moment of classroom discipline. No, Hart said, voice rising. I'm basing this on the welts on his back, on witnesses, and on the clear evidence that you targeted a student out of bias and resentment. He paused. You are hereby suspended, pending further disciplinary review. The room buzzed. Miss Whitmore rose stiffly and walked out, heels clicking against tile. But this time, her power didn't follow her. Elijah didn't watch her go. His eyes were on his future. 1 month later, Elijah walked into a different classroom, a college classroom, summer prep at State University. A room full of high schoolers, some already driving, already working part-time jobs. He was the youngest, but not the smallest. When the professor began the lesson, he raised his hand. What's the connection between limit theory and fractal geometry and natural growth patterns? The room went still. The professor blinked, then smiled. Let's find out together. Final scene. Back at Westridge Middle School, a new sign had been posted outside the math hallway. Above it hung a framed photo, Elijah smiling softly, holding a whiteboard covered in equations. The plaque read, "In honor of Elijah Thompson, whose mind broke barriers and whose courage rebuilt trust."